held some very prominent roles in business in Europe. He was head of Prudential, for example, and then he was head of the bank Credit Suisse. And at one stage, he had French nationality, and now, in an effort to deal with this question of the nationality law, he has given that up, and he's uh, reclaimed his Ivorian nationality. But the question is, will it be too late to be included in this year's election? And it looks like it because they've just published the voters' roll and said that he didn't sort this out in time to be included on this year's electoral register.
And just looking at Beyond, he has raised the issue of possibly representing another party, but he has also blamed party officials of the PDCI of their handling of the legal challenges with regards to Thiam's candidacy. Is there merit to the arguments that he's raising?
Well, no, it's very difficult to say because you have this other figure, the one that you mentioned in the introduction, Jean-Louis Billon. Now, he's a former minister. He's now a very successful businessman. He's a very capable guy, and he's a long-term member of the PDCI. Now, he is saying, well, if Tidjane Thiam can't be the candidate, then I'm putting myself forward. In fact, he already, even before the nationality issue cropped up, made a bid to be considered as an alternative person for the candidacy. But at the moment, the party, which is led by Thiam, and Thiam dominates the party apparatus, he's the leader of the party. The party doesn't seem inclined to give Mr. Billon the nomination. So some people might wonder, well, if you look at the example of what happened in Senegal last year, where the then opposition leader Ousmane Sonko was not legally qualified to stand for the presidency, so he appointed another senior party leader, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who then did stand for the presidency. Faye was elected, won the election, and he immediately made Sonko his prime minister. So some people might wonder, could the same thing happen here in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast? But it doesn't look like Mr. Billon and Mr. Thiam have that kind of relationship of trust that would allow that to happen. At the moment, the PDCI is basically sticking to the strategy that it's Thiam or nothing. If Thiam can't be the candidate, we won't put anyone else forward. Doesn't look as if Mr. Billon will be able to convince the party machine. If he tries to run on his own, he may well be qualified for the election. He may well have a small party under whose banner he could stand, but it would be very unlikely that he could win the election or do well.
Beyong has also said that it's time that candidates like Alassane Ouattara, that we mentioned earlier on, Laurent Gbagbo and others, that it's time that they leave the political scene, that there is a need for a change in terms of politicians and that generation. Is he making a point? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, yes, that is an argument that finds favor with a lot of people in Cote d'Ivoire because, as in most African countries, the population is overwhelmingly youthful. So, we're looking at a country where probably half of the voters are under the age of 30. Not half the population, but quite possibly half of all the voters. So many people think, well, if it's such a young country, like many other African countries, it would be a good idea to have a president from a younger generation because Alassane Ouattara, he is currently 83 years old. He's been in office since he won the 2010 election. There was this conflict afterwards, so he was able to take up the job the following year, 2011. So he's now been president already, in effect, running the government for 14 years, which is quite a long time, obviously.
Hmm.
And many people feel that this is a moment for generational change. In all the political disputes and conflict that dominated the country in the 1990s and in the first decade of this century, there were three dominant politicians. There was Mr. Ouattara, there was Henri Konan Bédier, who was president in the late 1990s, and who died, I think it was in 2023, or 2024, and then 2023, and then there was Mr. Gbagbo, Laurent Gbagbo, who was president in the early part of this century. But they were obviously, Mr. Bédier is no longer with us. Mr. Ouattara, Mr. Gbagbo are all of an older generation. And in fact, at the time of the last election, Mr. Ouattara himself said that it was time for generational change. It was time to hand the baton on to the next generation. But his preferred successor candidate then died of a heart attack. Mr. Amadou Gon Coulibaly died, and so at that stage, Mr. Ouattara stepped back into the arena and said, well, one person I think who could have been my successor, he has died, so I must fill this gap, even though I will be criticized for it. He admitted that his move would be unpopular with many people, that he would be widely criticized, but he did it, and because of the very unusual circumstances, many Ivorians accepted that argument. They kind of said, well, it's not a perfect situation, but since you're a competent president, we understand these special circumstances. But this time around, it's different because there is not only in the opposition with Tidjane Thiam, but there are also in the government camp. There are a couple of people as well who could be good successors. So it's much harder for Mr. Ouattara to make the argument that there isn't anybody else in the younger generation.
Would somebody like Thiam have been able to inject a bit of enthusiasm, particularly looking at the youth vote? And I'm just looking at the 2024 African Youth Survey that they did. And obviously, generally, what are the core issues for the youth have been unemployment, the rising cost of living, and corruption. It's across the board. But I want to focus on Cote d'Ivoire itself. Would somebody like Thiam have resonated with the youth demographic and actually seen an upsurge in support?
I think he could have done. Now, he's in his early 60s now. So obviously, compared to most voters, that is not young. But he's a fresh face because although he was briefly a minister in the 1990s in an important job responsible for infrastructure, he then left the country. And during the period of conflict in Cote d'Ivoire, of civil war and then partition of the country, I mean, at one stage, the country was actually divided. The north and the south were separated with a UN peacekeeping force along the boundary line. All of that period of crisis, he was away. He was abroad, mostly in Europe, in a series of big financial sector jobs. And so, although he's not a young man, although he's a middle-aged man, he's only been back in political life in the country really for 18 months, 2 years. And so in that sense, he has come back with an image of being someone fresh. And I think the fact that he's been in the international business scene, and not just in France, he's been in Switzerland, he's been in the UK, he's been a very, that's given him a different aura, if you like. But there's also another side of Cote d'Ivoire, which is, of course, you do have all these young electors, but you also have people who are a bit older. not much older, but a bit older, who have a very good memory of those crisis years in the first 10 years of this century, or
And
10,
just
11 years of this century. People don't want to go back to that. And Mr. Cham, as somebody from outside of all those quarrels who was not involved, has appeal for them too.
And just from a philosophical, ideological perspective, I'll go back to our original issue, that issue of foreign origin. And also the youth. We've seen the youth being mobilized by some of the previous incumbents to win a seat at the helm. And it's become a real concern across, it's a wave that's going through the African continent of people who can be seen as being ripe for being manipulated by foreign entities or global North powers. So is this something that the youth in Cote d'Ivoire at the moment are concerned with?
Well, a little bit. And certainly, as you say, the anti-Western stance, for example, of the military coup leaders in the Sahel countries, which are neighboring Cote d'Ivoire, that has some popular appeal with the youth. But Ivorians are also quite realistic. They know that they are living in a country which, in economic terms, is one of the strongest economies in Africa. You know, the economy, we're talking about 6-8% growth year after year after year. There's a lot at stake. So there are problems of unemployment. There are problems of poverty. But people also know that they have something to lose if the country is governed in a way that doesn't look after that economic inheritance and doesn't preserve those jobs. Cote d'Ivoire is a country that attracts quite a lot of investment. When you go to Abidjan, main city, it feels dynamic and it feels like an important international place that's attracting international interest. And people are aware of that and they don't want to lose that.
And just finally, from an optics perspective, because if we are talking about, a greater preference for democracy, but the corruption that is an impediment to it. The truth of the matter is the optics are, and the facts are, that the elite often have homes in France. How much is that something that preoccupies not only the youth, but those who are looking for a fresh start?
Well, it preoccupies a little bit, but I think people in Cote d'Ivoire, this is a country that has very close links with France. There are lots and lots. One of the reasons why this law about nationality, for example, is actually one that dates from just the years, it was inherited from the French legislation. It wasn't originally, it's not a law that was invented by the Ivorians. It's a law that was inherited from French law, but then didn't get abolished, if you like. And mostly it's not been enforced because very large numbers of the Ivorian, not just their political leaders, but a lot of their business leaders and a lot of their sportsmen. After all, remember, this is the country that is a current holder of the Africa Cup of Nations. Football is a huge deal in Cote d'Ivoire. And many of the top footballers are people with a dual national background. They've grown up in Paris. They've played for teams all over Europe. So Ivorians are kind of the nationality law, although the nationality law is not something that it's not a recent invention in the name of Ivorian national sovereignty. It's something that's been around and never properly enforced because people are, Didier Drogba, the famous footballer, who's a national hero in Cote d'Ivoire.
Paul Melly, I'm afraid the line is deteriorating. I'm not sure what is happening, but I think we do get the gist of what you're saying. Much appreciated your time and your insights. Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow of the Africa Programme at Chatham House in London.
We are on OpenView's audio bouquet. Channel 628.
África. Conhece o Ntivani?
Claro que sou eu.
Ntivani é o amante da música de corpo e alma.
Eu amo música africana.
Ele aprecia todos os tipos de melodias e passa os seus dias a ouvir a Channel África.
Ok.
Adivinha só, a Channel África quer ajudar o Ntivani e os amantes da música em todo o lado a descobrir ainda mais música incrível. Por isso, a Channel África está a convocar artistas africanos a submeterem as suas músicas. Músicos, lembrem-se de nos dar todas as informações relevantes no music@channelafrica.co.za. As submissões são a vossa oportunidade de ser ouvidos, mas não garantem inclusão na lista. Todas as submissões serão cuidadosamente analisadas para verificar se cumprem os requisitos da nossa estação. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Channel Africa, where every moment is an African celebration. Feel the energy. Feel the connection. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Ahoy, matey!
Captain here to help, right, boys?
Set sail with us on a digital voyage like no other. Channel Africa has a treasure trove of awesomeness. That is our website and social media pages.
Tell me, why are you here?
We want you to be part of our adventure.
The winds are changing, Captain. And this time...
Imagine a world where curiosity knows no bounds, where entertainment meets enlightenment, and where every click leads to the African perspective. Visit us on our website, www.channelafrica.co.za, or follow us on Instagram or on X at Channel Africa One. Go on, like us on Facebook at Channel Africa One. So, spread the word. Tell a friend that Channel Africa's online variety is what they need on the web. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it's 27 minutes past 9. A very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us if you've just joined us here on Africa World Hour on Channel Africa. Thank you very much. As we bring you the latest news in 60 minutes. This time we talk about world leaders meeting in the French city of Nice this week for the UN Ocean Conference, the largest summit ever focused on ocean health. Despite a global goal to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030, only 2.7% are currently effectively protected. The mounting threats from climate change, overfishing and pollution, experts say stronger action is urgently needed. Joining us now from Nice to discuss what's at stake now is Charlotte Wagner, Senior Ocean Scientist at Stockholm Environment Institute, USA. Very good evening to you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Sidi. So very nice to speak to you tonight.
So let's talk about what's on the agenda for the summit. We've already said what warnings have been sounded, but what is of a pressing and urgent need to discuss and resolve at this summit?
Yeah, this summit is, as you said, really the first time that this many people, especially global leaders, meet around the world. And the reason is that the ocean is rapidly degrading, but we were also realizing that we all depend on it. So at this summit is really a moment to get together and try to think about ways that we can manage the oceans more sustainably.
And just from the pledges that have been made in the past, what are the major gaps, as we mentioned what the goal is? I mean, to speak about 2.7% with such growing climatic changes and ever increasing, phenomenal disasters that we're seeing, why is it so slow, the progress?
I think for a long time, people thought that the ocean was far away, unless you were a coastal community where you had the ocean right in front of you. you were under the impression that the ocean was essentially an unlimited resource, which I think has made progress really slow. This is changing now, and there is a number of international agreements underway. You mentioned the 30 by 30 goal, which is to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. The High Seas Treaty was mentioned by French President Emmanuel Macron this morning. That's really a legally binding agreement intended to more sustainably manage the open ocean, which is the majority of the ocean. And then there's also the UN Plastics Treaty. So all of these three treaties are currently being negotiated and progress is being made. And so this is it's really about those. It's about these commitments that are hopefully underway and that global leaders are here to discuss this week.
I mean, are we making a compelling case? And I'm talking about our leaders here. And is there enough political will being shown if we just look at the SDG goals 13, 14, and 15, and they're all interconnected. All the SDGs are interconnected. But, one can't make a decision to take a tropical island holiday, for instance, without thinking about whether or not if that country has adequate early warning systems should a disaster arise.
Yeah, I think you are very right. I think we have probably not been making as compelling as a case as is really warranted. I think as scientists, it's kind of our obligation to try to establish and showcase to decision makers that these links are well established and that there is really a need for policy action and not just for more research. But I think also as societies more generally, we just need to be much more aware of how our actions feed back down the line.
But the uptake in terms of the BBNJ agreement and advancing ratifications, where is that? Are countries showing willingness? Are they showing enough? And in terms of their own national architecture to advance these commitments that they've signed on to?
Yeah. Well, so I think the BBNJ agreement is a really good example because once ratified by 60 countries, it will actually be legally binding, meaning that countries will have to conserve 30% of global oceans. We're getting pretty close. So far, about 50 countries have ratified the convention, and so only about 10 are missing. And so it would be a really strong signal if after UNOC this week, more countries ratified it and it could actually be implemented.
Just civil society, and I'm thinking about it from a South African perspective. Because often when we talk about clean energy and, the government makes a case of how this is a holistic approach, which will include getting everybody at the table, you'll find that pressure groups are saying constantly that this is not the case. If we talk about marine protected areas and, financing and fisheries, there is evidence that some of these things are just at a high level, but in enacting some of these laws or these treaties, not everybody's fully invited to the table. Your thoughts on that?
I would totally agree. I think this is a problem in many of these negotiations, as well as just decision making globally, is that people who already have the power get to ultimately decide what happens, and people who are marginalized, and I mean this in the case of ocean certainly includes many coastal communities, small-scale fisheries, they just often do not have a seat at the table. And so in some sense, bringing the importance of the ocean for global food chains and much of global economy really and livelihoods here at UNOC hopefully can strengthen the voices of some of the more vulnerable coastal communities who often do not have a seat at the table when decisions are being made.
In terms of the multilateral systems, what protection mechanisms are there for, and I'm just thinking of indigenous nations who are, some of them not even recognized in terms of their national heritage, for instance. We've seen this, and I'm just thinking of the bigger picture. If we're talking about peace and justice, these are areas that we often also don't talk about. People's inherent claim to some of the land, the resources, their indigenous knowledge of the work that they've already done to protect the seas, to protect living organisms, on land as well.
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, but I learned last week at the Science Congress, which preceded the UN Ocean Conference, in which was a gathering of about 2,000 scientists from all over the globe, that in fact it might be possible under international law to sue governments for the harm they are doing for the ocean. I think more often than not, indigenous communities and other communities like the ones you're describing are limited by their national legal circumstances. And since in many systems it is extremely difficult to access these legal avenues, I think it's often very difficult. But there are a number of examples where communities have been able to enforce their rights to their local resources. But I think this is very much still an area that would need strengthened legal protections.
So, Charlotte, let's take your organization, for instance, the work that you're doing. Is there a recognition of the vital role that some of these communities play in not only regulating the climate, ensuring sustaining food security and livelihoods, and preserving biodiversity? Is there, a corner that is etched out for them in terms of what we could learn from them in these marine ecosystems, or how we could just bring them in?
Yeah, at Stockholm Environment Institute, much work in different parts of the organization focuses on working with local communities, recognizing their needs in projects that we do. We often dedicate at least portions of projects to understanding what local stakeholders actually need and how we can support them. So yes, I think there is a recognition. Globally, I do think, though, including in our organization, that we can always do more to support and strengthen these voices.
All right, Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Charlotte Wagner is Senior Ocean Scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, USA, just speaking to us about that all-important conference that is taking place in the French city of Nice, the UN Ocean Conference. It's 22 minutes to 10.
Get the news, music, and lifestyle of Africa on Channel Africa, the African perspective. We are on OpenView's audio bouquet. Channel 628.
Hello, Africa. We would love to hear your voice on our radio station. Be part of the fun and send a shout out or greeting message to your loved ones and your favorite Channel Africa presenters. Whether you're in Africa, the diaspora, or anywhere else around the globe, we want to hear your voice. Send your shout out message by sending an email to info@channelafrica.co.za or send them to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Help us diversify our sound with your voice. Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Es-tu préoccupé par quelque chose? Es-tu passionné par les questions qui comptent? As-tu une voix qui mérite d'être entendue? Eh bien, nous avons la plateforme parfaite pour toi. Téléphone-nous ou fais-nous un WhatsApp au +27 66 408 87 42 et nous te rappellerons. Sois dans la conversation.
Salut Channel Africa, ici Beno le Diamant Rouge aka Binal Export depuis le Cameroun, le pays des lions. Voilà.
Sois dans la conversation. participation. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de parler, mais c'est ta chance d'exprimer ton point de vue, de partager tes opinions et de t'engager avec une communauté qui valorise ton avis. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, visitez notre site www.channelafrica.co.za et préparez-vous à partager vos points de vue sur Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And just about 20 minutes to 10, we continue with some of the day's top stories. And as you just heard in that promotional item there, we really would like to hear from you. Send us your views on what we talk about on the program. And of course, what is shaping your views in your community or just the life that you're choosing to live. 063-406-9126. You can drop your messages there. It's our WhatsApp number. So South Africa has seen a sharp rise in weather-related disasters over the past 4 decades, from devastating floods to powerful storms. A major new study led by Dr. Mary Jane Bopape, Managing Director of the South African Environmental Observation Network, examines these events in detail using extensive climate and disaster data from 1980 to 2023. The findings reveal not just where and when disasters are occurring, but also how human factors like urbanization are increasing the risks. We're joined now by Dr. Bopape to discuss South Africa's future and how the country can best prepare for what lies ahead. Dr. Bopape, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Really appreciate it.
Good evening, Tsepiso, and good evening to the listeners of Channel Africa. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to share about the studies that we have conducted.
So let's just look at your study, and if you could just share with us the salient points, the findings that came out of it.
Yes, so we were interested in understanding which parts of South Africa are reporting the most disasters, natural disasters specifically, and what the type of disasters are. So we used an international data set, which is called the Emergency Events Database. So this is a database that was an initiative of the World Health Organization, as well as the government of Belgium, where they report disasters based on 4 factors. So an event is recorded as a disaster if it leads to the death of 10 or more people, or if it affects 100 or more people, or if there is a call for international assistance, or the 4th one is that there has to be a declaration of a disaster. So we looked at that data set and considered 1980 up until 2023 and asked which are the disasters that are being reported in South Africa. And we found that floods are leading. And this is actually similar to across the globe, that when we look globally, floods are actually the leading natural disaster that's being experienced. And then for South Africa, that's followed by storms. So storms would include thunderstorms, hailstorms, winter storms, and then with hailstorms we will also include like your tropical cyclones that we know can impact South Africa coming from the east. The other question that we were asking was also what are the weather systems that are responsible for these disasters in South Africa? So in terms of where these disasters are occurring, we found eThekwini is actually leading in terms of reporting the number of natural disasters in South Africa. And then when we look at provincial level, we found that KwaZulu-Natal is reporting the most disasters. And this, we can say, is linked to what we know of our rainfall climatology. We know the western parts of South Africa is drier compared to the east. So there is a gradient as you go towards the east, with rainfall increasing as you go there. But however, if we look at eThekwini and you compare it against the districts, other districts within KwaZulu-Natal, we don't really find that there is more rainfall in eThekwini that is received compared to the other districts, and yet it reports the most disasters. And that is what made us conclude that it shows that there are human factors that are contributing to the occurrence of disasters, because we know with urban areas, for example, that you've got more, buildings, you've got more people in the urban areas compared to the rural areas.
I want to ask you something, Dr. Bopape. Just recently we were speaking to Ghana's former ambassador to South Africa, and he had written a piece comparing, the management of comparing two cities, Cape Town and Johannesburg. Now, if we're speaking about urbanization here and the factors that you've just mentioned here, so the Cape Metro, for instance, where does it fall in terms of the disaster patterns that we've seen? And does it have, by nature of it being next to the sea, more floods, more storms? What are you able to tell us from your study?
Yeah. So Cape Town and Johannesburg, we found were actually comparable. I think first, if you look at Cape Town, across the whole western part of South Africa, it's basically the Cape Town metro that is reporting the most disasters. And again, it is that metro, aspect that is coming up. And then, so we found, for example, that Cape Town reported 10 flooding events and then 5 storms. And then with Johannesburg, we found it reported 11 flooding events. And then in terms of the storms, there were 5 of these that were reported. But what we need to keep in mind is also the fact that these natural disasters occur linked to specific weather systems. The type of system that we are experiencing at the moment is called a cutoff low system. So we actually found that it is this type of system that is responsible for the majority of the natural disasters occurring in South Africa. We found 61% of the events actually being because of the cutoff low system. And then the second one is what we call an upper trough. So they are not too different from one another. It's just that with a cutoff low system, we say there's a closed low. With a trough, it's basically just a bit of a curve. I think the good news, you were speaking to somebody also speaking about the issue of early warning systems.
Yes.
So the good news with these two systems is actually that the models that we use to produce weather forecasts are able to capture them actually very well, which is why from last week already, we knew that this week it was going to be cold. We knew there was going to be like in Cape Town from Saturday morning, we knew it was going to start getting cold, and that is because these types of weather systems, the models are really able to capture them well. And what that means is that by using early warning systems, we can actually reduce the types of impacts that are associated with these systems.
And what about management of these disasters? Because when I'm thinking of migratory patterns internally, we speak about the role of urbanization in these events or disasters and the findings that you are seeing. What can you tell us about that?
So I think first in terms of, so with migration, we know that there are more people that are moving towards the cities. And what that actually means is that we are going to see an increase in terms of the impacts associated with these events. The issue of climate change, we know it is happening. We know from our ground observations, we can say using in-situ observations collected in South Africa, we are seeing more heavy rainfall events. The heat waves, we looked at them as well, but then they were really underestimated in the data set that we are looking at. But then, events such as those, we know that we are going to see more of them because of climate change. Urban migration, we know will continue to increase the impacts. So when we manage the disasters themselves, still sticking to the issue of early warning systems, I think you may have heard about what is called an initiative called Early Warnings for All, which is an initiative of the United Nations. It was announced on World Meteorological Day in 2022, where they indicated that by 2027, they would like everybody to have access to early warning systems, and they've asked the World Meteorological Organization to lead the initiative. And the WMO has since come up with what they say are pillars that inform what needs to happen, the pillars of early warning systems. So the first one is basically an understanding of your exposure. I mean, if we go and build in areas that we know are prone to flooding, then you know that every year, maybe when there's heavy rainfall, you will be impacted by these events. And then there is a pillar that speaks to the actual science that we rely on, the observations we use, as well as the models that we use to be able to forecast these events, as I've mentioned, with the event that we're experiencing this week, that the types of models that are able to pick this type of event. And then there's a third component that actually speaks to dissemination and communication. I mean, communication first in saying what we say in terms of early warning systems needs to make sense to the person that needs to respond. I mean, if I can't come and say, well, there's a 30% chance of this and 50% chance of this, what should I do with this information? Which is why WMO is encouraging what they call impact-based forecasting, where instead of talking about what the weather is going to be like, you talk about what the weather is going to be, and then in that way the people that need to respond are able to do so. And then the fourth pillar is the one that actually speaks to an ability to respond. And I mean, I think it's actually a lot more complicated than just saying we are able to respond. Yes. Because if you tell me today that it's gonna flood where I live now in my house, where do I go if it's going to so it's more complicated.
Dr. Mary Jane, I don't know if you know how amenable you are to this, because I unfortunately I have to listen to my producer, and he's saying time is up, and I feel like there's such a wealth of information to get out of the study. I wonder how amenable you would be to just speaking to us again, especially as we're experiencing this cold front, and we are also expecting some sort of disasters to occur. Would you be willing to do that, to continue that conversation with us?
Yes, I'll be able to continue. Although the particular system that's happening now, I wouldn't have all the details.
Okay,
it's the South African Weather Service that will have that.
All right, but thank you so much for your time, and I do hope that we connect with you soon. Dr. Mary Jane Bopape is Managing Director of NRF, South African Environmental Observation Network. Fascinating study that they've put out there.
Africa Update on Channel Africa.
Over 35 organizations are expected to converge at the Union Buildings in Pretoria over illegal immigrants in South Africa. They say South Africa is facing a myriad of challenges and that foreign nationals are worsening the situation. Yes, Khutato, just take us through the main aims of the march, what you're hoping to get from them.
So we are basically saying to the President of the Republic of South Africa, illegal immigration is a pandemic. Implement the laws. It's not that we don't have these laws. How many people are being human trafficked? How many people are being hijacked? Our schools are full. Our hospitals are full. And it's almost as if we're carrying the burdens of the entire Africa at the expense of South Africans. And we are basically saying enough is enough. We want the President of the Republic of South Africa to meet us at the Union Building. We've submitted letters to say that we are coming on this day. We want to meet with him there to give him this mandate, because clearly he has failed citizens. He's failed South Africans by failing to implement the law. That's the most important thing. We are going to give you a mandate. We, the people, shall govern.
Africa Update with Lulu Kabu on Channel Africa every weekday from 12 to 2 p.m. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
8 minutes to 10. As we wrap up, we speak about this amid rising political tensions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Authorities have imposed a 90-day media ban on coverage of former President Joseph Kabila and his party, the PPRD. The Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, has condemned the move as a very serious threat to press freedom. We now speak to Jonathan Rosen, CPJ's senior Africa researcher, to understand the impact of this decision and also what led to it. A very good evening to you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
So what communique was put out? What was the rationale behind this ban, and how will it be effected?
So the order came on June 2nd from the media regulator in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the order was for all media to cease their coverage of the People's Party for Reconstruction and Democracy, which is the political party of the former president of the country, Joseph Kabila, and for those that coverage to cease for 90 days, as you point out. And this order not only has a directive to cease coverage, but it also forbids all communication channels effectively from offering any space, as they term it, to the party and to the former president. And it threatens a very heavy sanction in accordance with the law and tasks the prosecutor general to enforce the order. And as a justification, they're claiming that Kabila and his party are financially and ideologically supporting the M23 and the AFC, rebel groups in the eastern part of the country.
And obviously this will, whether they admit it or not, impede on press freedom. How does it line up with the DRC's own constitutional protections of media freedom and freedom of expression?
Well, certainly it's a clear attack on freedom of the press. The National Press Union has also called it censorship. It is an effort to control what the media reports in connection with the conflict, the war in the east of the country, in connection with a very prominent politician, in connection with the political dynamics of the country, which are essential for the public and people around the world to understand what's happening in the country. At times of war, it's essential that the press is unhindered in its ability to cover the dynamics involved in the conflict so that people can make decisions about how to manage their own lives.
So it is clear censorship, but is this unusual for the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly if you look at the amount of influence and the ownership of the press in the DRC?
Unfortunately, tactics to control coverage around this conflict are not new. We've seen threats by the government against outlets that are covering the rebel groups and their activities. Previously, we've seen efforts to constrain that coverage. We've also seen threats against journalists coming from all sides, from the rebel groups themselves, death threats against reporters for covering government activities as well. Really, journalists in the east of the country are facing threats and dangers from all sides of this conflict. But press freedom issues in the DRC certainly predate the recent advance by rebel groups in the east. The government passed legislation, a new press law and a digital code in 2023 that maintained the criminalization of reporting, criminalized what they term as false news. These conditions for journalists in the DRC have been a serious concern for the Committee to Protect Journalists for a long time. And unfortunately, these more recent efforts by the authorities to control coverage are really just an extension of those efforts.
So what can the press do given this current environment?
Well, really, the journalists there are doing their best to report the news. Certainly solidarity from our side is something that we're trying to deliver. We're trying to support journalists there as much as possible. Journalists, again, are essential in moments like this. And so we know that they're trying to do their jobs, and we're hoping that we're able to support them as much as possible and that they're able to receive the support from the public in the country and from the international community as well.
So CPJ, you've documented similar cases of state-led censorship tied to political or military accusations in the DRC before. Can you give us examples and how and if you were able to overcome it?
Well, we were documenting efforts earlier during the advance of the M23 around Goma earlier this year. We saw the suspension of Al Jazeera. We saw threats against other international broadcasters. We've seen consistently attacks on reporters trying to cover the conflict coming from all sides. But this is not a dynamic that we've only seen in the DRC. Across the Sahel and elsewhere around the world, we see a similar pattern where authorities look to control the narrative of a conflict, look to constrain the voices, and maintain a narrative. And so, what we're looking at here in the DRC is a serious concern. And it's unfortunately part of a broader pattern of censorship in connection with conflict around the world.
And just finally, going forward, what type of impact would this latest action have on the objective reporting on the political landscape in the DRC, especially given the developments that are ongoing, peace talks and the ongoing violence in parts of the country?
Certainly the political dynamics, those peace talks you mentioned, and ongoing hostilities are of public interest. These are issues that the public and people around the world need to have information about. And so this sort of effort to constrain reporting, to threaten criminal sanction, to try and control the narrative is going to have a chilling effect on reporters. Naturally, when authorities threaten that type of action, there's likely going to be a limitation placed on reporting. And so that's why we've called for the reversal of this order, for there to be a rollback of the efforts to control the media and to allow them to report freely.
Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated. Jonathan Rosen, Senior Africa Researcher for the Committee to Protect Journalists, joining us from New York about what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The government there has issued